we are here 15 years after you helped the world wake up to the climate crisis with an inconvenient truth. Today, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic that the crisis will be averted?
Well, thank you for having me on, Emily. Overall, I'm optimistic because we have seen a banner year in 2020 for sustainability. There is a threat of greenwashing, and it needs to be monitored. It needs to be dealt with. The new chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission just started taking steps here in the U.S., and similarly, we've seen some concern expressed elsewhere. It really needs to be dealt with. But overall, there has been an enormous increase, a tripling of sustainability-related financing flows since 2015. And flows into ESG funds have had a tenfold increase since 2015. And 3/4 of the global economy now is in nations that are under net zero commitments. Last year, if you look at new electricity generating power plants around the world, 90% of those built last year were solar and wind. And there are lots of similarly encouraging examples. But some of these commitments are for net zero by 2050, which is good, but commitments that will mature when all of the executive teams and all of the political leaders involved are long gone from the scene leave a little bit to be desired. So the focus is shifting toward near-term goals with a 50% reduction by 2030, just 9 years from now. And a lot of companies are making similar commitments, but you've got to pull back the top layers and look more deeply, because some of the companies that are making these commitments don't include their full emissions, the so-called Scope 3 emissions, which for large companies is the bulk of them. And some of the ones that make the 2050 commitments don't include 2030 commitments, which is really the key.
So your report flags greenwashing, as you mentioned, as a big issue, which is basically misleading the public about just how green your company and your products are. How do we address this?
Well, as I say, the SEC is beginning to take steps, and regulators elsewhere are beginning to look more closely at this. But investors have to play a key role as well. And now that we are seeing this dramatic shift into the sustainability revolution, and by the way, at Generation, we believe that we're in the early stages of a global sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the industrial revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And we're seeing transformative changes in almost every sector of the economy. And that's very, very encouraging. But investors who want to participate in this have to take care to identify the risk of greenwashing. You know, you saw recently, or heard and saw, the lobbyist for ExxonMobil admitting, I guess he didn't realize the circumstances of the videotape, but he just admitted what many of us have long known, that there's just been a lot of highly cynical greenwashing at ExxonMobil. And if you look at the other large oil and gas companies, most of them do not include the full range of emissions in their pledges to go to net zero. And some of them just focus on becoming a little bit more efficient in producing more oil and gas, and they just ignore the consequences of how the oil and gas is used. And that's an example of greenwashing. The European Commission took a look at this and found on EU websites a very large percentage of these pledges and statements were misleading. And so it's a buyer beware. We really have to crack down on this. And again, investors have a role to play.
So let's talk about the investment, where it's happening. Is it happening in the right places? What are the most important trends you'd call out in terms of where the money is going?
Well, I mentioned one of them with electricity generation. 90% last year was solar and wind, and the International Energy Agency projects that in the decades going forward, it's going to be 95% solar and wind. So the fossil fuel companies are losing that market. They realize that. Next in line is mobility. Electric vehicles are really beginning a big surge. They will fall below the price of their internal combustion engine counterparts next year in important model categories, and in the next 2, 3, 4 years in all model categories. So they're losing that market as well. And the risk of stranded assets is growing, by the way. You remember, of course, the subprime mortgage crisis, which created the credit crisis and the Great Recession. Well, there are $22 trillion worth of in this subprime carbon bubble, where there may be an enormous bubble of stranded assets there. One of the problems, Emily, is that the financing for these mature sectors like electricity generation and mobility, building retrofits, the financing is not going to the developing countries in the volumes that are necessary. More political risk, higher interest rates, and the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and regular banks, need to revise their approach and stop financing these dirty fossil fuels that kill people and create worse global warming, and direct more of the flow toward these exciting opportunities of the future that are already. Electricity is cheaper from solar and wind, and drivers prefer the electric vehicles. We can see where this is going, but the finance flows need to anticipate this change more than they are now.
Have you personally talked to President Biden about climate, and what have you discussed?
Oh, sure. I mean, he's been a friend for decades, and yes, I have. I don't ever talk about conversations that are in private with a president of the United States. I kind of got into that habit when I was VP, and I've kept it. I didn't talk about my conversations with President Trump. I'll tell you, they didn't go as well as the conversations with Joe Biden. I think he's doing a terrific job. And I think the agreement announced to include so many, a huge climate agenda in this pending reconciliation bill is yet another sign of the leadership he's providing.
So on that note, Democrats are proposing a carbon border adjustment tax in their budget. What do you think? Does it have legs?
Well, I'm all in favor of that, because if a nation like ours, for example, takes steps that account for the carbon pollution, and then some other country says, no, we don't pay any attention to that, there ought to be a border adjustment. The European Union is moving aggressively in that direction. I think that is the way to go. I know it's a point of dialogue between the U.S. and the European Union, but count me in favor of the carbon border adjustments.
So given what you dealt with as vice president, what's your advice to this administration with so many swings and misses in the past on climate? They've got control of Congress, but by a very thin margin. How do you get Republicans on side? How do you make climate action irreversible so we can avoid what happened under Trump?
Well, I think there are some important changes since the days when I was in the White House. First of all, perhaps most important, the climate crisis itself is now producing these incredibly dangerous, destructive, climate-related extreme events. As we're having this conversation, Emily, people are being evacuated from 60 large fires in the U.S. The fire season started earlier than last year's record season. We saw the hundreds of deaths in Oregon from the heat wave last week. A beautiful little town in Canada, 121 degrees, and then the next day destroyed by fire. Lake Mead is at the lowest level since the Hoover Dam was built, and they started filling the lake. The entire West is in a mega drought. You saw the videos of people walking through water up to their waist in the New York City subway stops. And there are similar tragic events all over the world. It's incredible what's happening, and I think it has awakened people to the urgency of this. And so I think the political environment is different. You're right that the resistance among Republicans is still high. They're still enthralled to the former president and, this nonsense that the climate crisis, they have a view of it that's separated from reality. However, Democrats have the opportunity in the Senate to use this so-called reconciliation procedure, which allows them to do it even if they don't get Republican votes. And of course, the House has majority rule, so it can pass there as well. But I would also point this out. On 65 college campuses in the U.S., the young Republican clubs have joined together to petition the Republican National Committee to change its position on climate, lest they lose that entire generation. And just last week, some 60 Republican members announced a new Republican organization devoted to climate. I don't know how far they're willing to go, but it's a good first step. And I hear from my Republican friends that, you know, they want elected officials in both parties to move on this. Vast majority of Republican voters in the U.S. are in favor of bold action on climate now.
Now, China's carbon footprint still dwarfs the rest of the world. And speaking of politics, with what seems to be the decoupling of the U.S. and China happening right now, how optimistic are you that China will do its part?
Well, you know, just today, China announced that it is going to launch its long-awaited carbon markets initiative, starting with power plants, but it's scheduled to expand throughout their economy. They're going to launch it on Friday. President Xi Jinping surprised the world last fall by announcing a net zero goal for China, 2060, which is a little bit too far out. And I hope that by the Glasgow conference at the end of this year on climate, the most important climate conference since the Paris Agreement, I hope that they'll bring that goal closer to the present day. They've built more solar and wind than the rest of the world put together, electric vehicles, electric buses, smart trains, long-distance DC cables, but they're still building as much coal capacity as the entire rest of the world put together. So they do need to do more. But the dialogues between the Biden White House and President Xi's team, John Kerry's doing a great job facilitating that. They have been going in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that China will take more aggressive steps. And in the lead up to Paris, it was China and the U.S. together that made that a success. I'm hoping that history will repeat itself with the Glasgow conference.
Now, Richard Branson just went up into space. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk think we need to be able to live in space and perhaps even on Mars in order for the human race to survive a disaster. I'm curious, what do you think of these efforts in space or Mars as Plan B?
Well, I'm all for exploration, and I hear those who say, let's concentrate on planet Earth. But I would remind everybody that our ability to understand and deal with the climate crisis depends very heavily on space-based assets. Generation has helped to finance this new Climate Trace initiative, which is using existing satellite constellations and a lot of internet data streams to later this year identify the significant sources of greenhouse gas pollution all over the world. So it's not as if we have to choose. I understand that debate, but I remember back when I was young and the Apollo program was going on, I was always so excited about it. And I congratulate Richard Branson, wish Jeff Bezos well, and Elon Musk is already out there doing amazing things. And he has, all three of them, by the way, have been big allies and supporters of solving the climate crisis. And I want to give them kudos for that. All three of them have.
Now, speaking of, as you know, this is a technology show. We cover companies like Apple and Amazon and Microsoft, which are the three biggest tech companies, I should say, in the world. They've all laid out their sustainability plans. And I'm curious, do you think big tech is doing enough?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm on the board of Apple, so you will have to forgive me if I'm a little bit biased. I'm very proud of what Tim Cook and his executive team, especially Lisa Jackson, have done in reaching 100% renewable energy for the company's operations and soon for the entire global operations of Apple. Also Google and Microsoft. And Microsoft's gone the extra step to make a commitment to remove its legacy emissions. So I think that one of the keys is that consumer-facing companies are feeling the pressure from their customers, from their supply chain partners, certainly from their employees and executives and their families. And I think that's one of the reasons why the executive teams who really want to do this anyway are finding that it's good business sense to do it for multiple reasons. And you know, there are now more than 300 large multinational companies that have pledged to go to 100% renewable energy. And by the way, those corporate power purchase agreements have played a significant role in expanding the amount of solar capacity and wind capacity in the world. Just take a moment and return to that statistic that 90% of all the new power plants in the world last year were solar and wind. That's incredible. This is one of the fastest transitions that we've ever seen in technology history. And we saw how the digital revolution disrupted so many sectors of the economy. The sustainability revolution is going to do that even more powerfully and just as rapidly.